Let's therefore, with a lot of questions still swimming around corona, go to the chief scientist of the World Health Organization, Dr. Soumya Swaminathan. Appreciate, ma'am, you joining me here today. Dr. Swaminathan, I want to start by the big question that's become a controversy at the moment. A group of 239 international scientists from across 32 countries, ma'am, have claimed that the virus is airborne, wants the World Health Organization to revise its rules and recommendations when it comes to physical distancing. Where does the WHO stand over the concern that the coronavirus could be airborne?
When somebody speaks or shouts or sings or even breathes, there are a lot of droplets that come out of our mouth. And these droplets are of different sizes. And what happens is that the larger droplets, they fall to the ground, onto the surface within 1 meter and certainly within 2 meters. And that is why this whole recommendation on maintaining a distance so that you don't have these droplets falling directly from one person onto another person. There are also smaller droplets, less than 5 microns in size. These are sometimes called aerosols. And because they're small, they actually form they can stay in the air for a little bit of time, and they take a little longer actually to settle to the ground. They can also be moved around by gusts of wind and things like that. And so these particles could be inhaled by other people who are in the vicinity, in the room. And this could be called airborne transmission, but it's very different from viruses like measles, etc., which are truly airborne in that they get spread through the air. They then, it's in the air, and people who are not in the room and who come in later can breathe it in. So I think the distinction really here, and there's been no proof of that as far as COVID-19 is concerned, but we have seen many instances of what we call super spreader events, where there's a choir practicing, or there's a nightclub, or some other closed, the meat packing factories and so on, where people were close together and where large numbers have got infected. So that could potentially be person to person if you're in close contact. It could also be if you're a little further away, but exposed to the virus within the next few minutes. So this virus could stay in the air for 10, 15 minutes. And if you're breathing that air and you're still in close proximity.
But let me get this very clear. The WHO is still maintaining that the coronavirus disease spread is primarily from person to person through small droplets, and only in exceptional cases could there be, in a limited way, an air transmission. Am I correct, ma'am?
Yes, there are special situations. So we don't say that it doesn't happen, but it's not like it's airborne, it's everywhere, and therefore there's nothing that can be done. You can see from the public health actions of being able to isolate and track contacts and quarantine them, that many countries have successfully controlled it. And if it was truly airborne, in that if it was everywhere, then all of us would have been infected by now. So even logically speaking, that's not it. So I think it's the science, but it needs to be also explained to people properly, because it's very, very important what precautions individuals are taking and what methods countries, ministries are putting in place. And that is why the majority is still, we say, is the droplet transmission. And if you can control that, you can control most of the transmission.
But again, to understand this, ma'am, there will still be a concern at the moment that if you are in a crowded place with poor ventilation, then physical distancing may not be enough. That's a concern, am I right? Crowded places with poor ventilation, especially indoors, could be a big concern going ahead.
Exactly. And one of the things that we have recommended for that is, if you're in such a setting, to wear a cloth mask or a face covering. And in fact, if everyone does that, then that reduces to a large extent, because these droplets are then blocked from actually coming out of the person's nose and mouth. But these need to be worn properly. Wherever possible, ventilation is good. So if doors and windows can be kept open, that's good. In places where there's air conditioning, that there are also special precautions that could be taken by increasing the exchange of fresh air, by putting in HEPA filters and so on. So there are things that could be done in different settings to make them safer. But I think for people, it's important to either try to avoid these wherever possible, like, for example, if it's a pub or a nightclub or some kind of social gathering, if possible, to avoid that. Second is to improve the ventilation in such places. And the third is for everyone to wear a mask when they are not able to physically distance.
Let me turn to the other issue which is now fiercely being debated among the medical community at the moment, herd immunity. A new study published in Lancet based on a Spanish sero survey concluded, ma'am, that herd immunity against COVID-19 is difficult to achieve, in some level unachievable. About 60,000 people were tested, only 5% developed antibodies. Do you believe herd immunity is going to be very difficult to achieve in a country like India, given the sheer size of the population?
Yes, so as I was saying earlier, most of the world's population is still susceptible, including in India, and that's come from these antibody studies. Even in a place, the study you mentioned in Spain, which was so badly affected, that had so many deaths, only 5% of the population has antibodies. So achieving herd immunity, first of all, is going to take a very long time, and secondly, is going to come at a cost, a cost in terms of loss of lives as well as illness in the community and prolonged lockdowns and things like that. So the best way to achieve herd immunity, in fact, the word herd immunity is usually used in the context of vaccination. For example, for measles, if you want to eliminate measles in a community, you vaccinate over 95% of children. That then achieves what is called herd immunity. So even if you have 5% of children who didn't receive the vaccine, they are protected because the remaining 95 are immune and therefore they don't spread the infection. So to break that transmission, you need 50 to 60% of the population to have immunity against this virus. And I should add that we are still understanding what is immunity against this virus. We're measuring antibodies, and so we know more about it. But there are also other immune responses, cell-mediated immune responses that play a role. We're learning about that. So in any case, if you have 50, 60% of people who have that immunity, then the virus stops transmitting from one person to the next. And we think that probably the best way, the safest way to achieve that would be through a vaccine.
You've used the V word, ma'am, vaccine, the question of our times. You know, in this country in the last week, there's been much talk with the ICMR claiming that by the 15th of August, along with Bharat Biotech, we hope to have a vaccine for corona, setting a deadline, trying to speed up the 3 critical clinical stages. How do you all see this? Do you see this dangerous of trying to set up a deadline of just 6 weeks for a vaccine when the rest of the world seems to be suggesting at the very minimum it will take 12 to 18 months?
So first of all, it's really incredibly encouraging to see the kind of vaccine development efforts that have happened all over the world, and to see that India is very much in the forefront of developing vaccines, not just as a manufacturing hub that can scale up the production of generic vaccines, but developing innovative vaccines through local R&D. And so I think kudos to all the companies that have been working on vaccine development, and of course to the government ministries like DBT, ICMR, and so on, the Ministry of Health, who've been supporting them. So I know of at least 7 Indian manufacturers and companies who have vaccine development efforts, and I believe that 2 of them are now approved to go into human clinical trials. Now, let me just say a few words about clinical trials and why it's important. So the first phase is when you inject a few tens of people, maybe 20, 30, 40 people, to get an idea of the safety of the vaccine. That's called a phase 1. And that usually happens after you've done your lab tests and the small animals like mice and rabbits. It's also tested in monkeys, but that could be done in parallel as it's being done in humans. Once you're satisfied about the safety of the vaccine in the small group of people, you then take it to a phase 2, which is usually hundreds of people, could be sometimes thousands, where you're testing the safety in a larger number, and you're also testing what is called the immunogenicity. How good an immune response is the vaccine actually stimulating in the body? And will that be enough to protect? Now, here there's a $1 million question, because we don't know what is protective immunity for this virus. And at this point of time, globally, there is not one test that would say, yes, if you achieve this then you achieve immunity against the virus. And that will come over a period of time. So then you need to go to phase 3 trial, which will be in tens of thousands of people, potentially, let's say 30,000 people,
Right.
where half of them will receive the vaccine, half will get the placebo or some other standard vaccine, and then you follow them up over a period of time, could be months, to see how many get infected in this group versus this group. And what you're looking for is that in the group that receive vaccines, you have a significantly lower number of people, 50%, 60%, less infection than you get in the control group.
What I'm trying to understand then, ma'am, given that you've given this elaborate process involved, can this be done in 6 weeks? As the ICMR claims, it's going to take, by all accounts, 12 to 18 months, isn't it?
No, it is not possible to do it in 6 weeks. This is going to...
Yes?
Correct.
12 to 18 months.
And that itself is a shortened timeline. Most vaccine development efforts take years. But because this is a pandemic, because everyone wants a vaccine as soon as possible, you shorten the timelines, and a very optimistic estimate is 12 to 18 months from the time that you start your vaccine development efforts. And maybe the clinical portion of that may take anywhere from 6 to 9 to 12 months, again, depending on how smoothly everything goes. So there are things that can be done to shorten the timelines, but the processes which need to be followed cannot be circumvented, especially since these are all new vaccine candidates that have not been tested. And as I mentioned, an important point is we don't know the immune correlate. So once we know the immune correlate, we will be able to use a blood test.
Ma'am, so to that extent, is it not ethically questionable to set these deadlines, put pressure on the labs to go ahead with clinical trials with this deadline? Isn't this an ethical question that should worry the WHO when India's leading medical body sets up a deadline of just 6 weeks and wants a vaccine in 6 weeks?
No, because I think that the Indian system is robust enough. It's not the first time that a vaccine or a drug is being developed and tested in India. And we have institutions and mechanisms which will protect and which are there to basically oversee this process. So you have institutional ethics committees which have to give approval for any human study before they can be started. You have the Drug Controller General's office, the CDSCO, which oversees the regulatory pathways, and every company has to submit a dossier and can only go to the next phase once they submit the results of the first phase of the study. And then, of course, you have the institutions within the government which will be involved in supporting these. And the vaccine developers and manufacturers have done this before. And so there's enough experience, I think, in the country that this would be done properly.
But am I right to say today that August 15th is an unrealistic deadline? Am I right in saying that?
So August 15th is, I think, not a deadline for anything. So it has to go phase by phase. So the phase 1 may be completed in the next 4 to 6 weeks. Again, it depends if everything goes well. But then you still need to go into phase 2 and eventually into phase 3.
So we are looking at 2021 at the very earliest for a vaccine. Am I right again, ma'am?
Realistically, yes. We'll be looking at the first quarter of 2021 to see the results of these trials. And then, of course, depending on how quickly the manufacturers can scale up the production.
Right.
And it could then be given. And we have to remember that in the first year or so, we think that there will be more demand than supply of any vaccines. We know that there are about 20 vaccines now in clinical development across the world. We're hoping several of them will be successful, including some of the Indian candidates. There are candidates from China as well as from the Europe and USA and Canada. So, but even then, globally, there will be limited doses of vaccine available. And that's why WHO is working with our partners, CEPI and Gavi, to accelerate R&D, but also to come up with a framework for fair allocation, equitable allocation of the limited doses. So again, the policy side of it also needs to be thought through. Who are you going to first give this vaccine to? Who are those high-risk people, the most vulnerable you want to protect?
The other
and arrangements to roll out a vaccine program would also need to be.
The other concern, Dr. Swaminathan, is while we wait for this vaccine, lots of drugs or a few drugs are certainly coming in the market. Remdesivir is being sold in large numbers now. Vial is being sold in Mumbai. Do you believe these drug treatments are actually a cure, or do they have very limited value? Earlier we saw a push for hydroxychloroquine, which the WHO has now rejected. How do you see these pushes for drugs as cures?
Yes, so obviously there is a huge amount of interest in developing treatments or cures for this virus, because as we wait for the vaccine, what we need to do is to actually prevent people from getting really sick and obviously from dying. And so the initial set of drugs that were picked for testing, for trials, were those that are what we call repurposed drugs like hydroxychloroquine and the anti-HIV drugs, some of the immune stimulants like interferon. So these, because they are already widely used in humans, we know the safety profile, etc. They were easy to put into trials quickly, and those set of trials are now giving us the results. Now, remdesivir is a drug that was developed for another RNA virus, the Ebola virus, was not shown to be effective for Ebola, and then was repurposed to test against this virus, COVID. And what it has shown so far is limited benefit, in the sense that it seems to reduce the duration of hospitalization. So perhaps it's aiding in recovery, but has not yet been shown in any of the trials to reduce the death rate among people who are severely ill. So what we need to do is to continue to study remdesivir to see at what stage of the disease it can be most useful. Perhaps it's to be given at an earlier stage before people get very, very ill, and then to use it in that group of patients for maximum benefit. And at the same time, many groups around the world are looking for other drugs. And what's on the horizon now is the monoclonal antibodies. So these antibodies are very specific against the virus. And if they're given especially early in the course, or they could even be given as prevention, those trials are going to start now to see if you can use monoclonal antibodies to either prevent people who are exposed from getting it, or to give it to people before they get sick. So to prevent the progression of the disease. So there's a lot of movement on that front.
So is there a specific WHO recommendation at the moment for a drug that can be used? Do you have a specific recommendation?
So the one drug that we've seen very promising results from is dexamethasone. The results of the UK's recovery trial, which showed that in people who are receiving oxygen or are on ventilation, so really those who have respiratory impairment, they have a significant benefit in reducing death by using dexamethasone. So our group now, the guideline group, is looking at all of these drugs and the evidence, and will be coming out shortly. But dexamethasone, I think is already becoming standard of care in many places. But we will also come out with recommendations on the other drugs, because they're all based on evidence, which has been accumulating over the last several weeks now. And I think wherever there's enough evidence, you make a recommendation. Where there isn't, you make a conditional recommendation and say we need more evidence.
There is one more concern, ma'am, that people have expressed in recent weeks of a relapse. We are hearing of people who finally test negative after having gone through the quarantine period, but that they fear a relapse. Are the fears justified? Can someone with COVID-19 have long-term lingering symptoms, breathlessness, other symptoms that could linger on?
Yes. So we're absolutely learning more about the longer term effects of this virus. And there have been publications coming out of cohort studies, people who've been followed over a period of time. And certainly it appears that a certain percentage, again, a minority, but particularly those who had severe illness, who had to be hospitalized, they seem to take weeks or months to recover. There have been some descriptions of neurological deficits, even minor strokes and things like that, of lethargy, extreme fatigue, of breathlessness, of lung function taking a long time to come back to normal. And as we follow these up, we're learning more. Hopefully, most of them will recover over a period of time. But the virus has gone away from the body. So the virus is no longer detectable in these people, but somehow it's affected either through the circulatory system, the blood vessels, and so on. It has impact which seems to last for longer. So it's not a relapse. It's more long-term effects of the acute infection.
Okay, that is very important what you've just said. Let me ask you though that we are told a WHO team is going to China this week. There has been a case of bubonic plague reported in Inner Mongolia province of China. Is there a concern that there could be other viruses out there from China, emanating from China, that could spread, or should we not read too much into it?
We get reports of plague constantly from around the world. It's one of the diseases that we monitor through the Emergency Operations Center. And so, yes, there is a report, but I think our team is looking into it. There isn't anything to be really concerned about at this point of time. The team that's going to China, the WHO team that's going, will discuss with the scientists on the ground there who have already been working on coronaviruses to try to lay out a plan for how to really, because this is not going to be something you can solve within a matter of days. It'll have to be a well-planned scientific investigation and effort into finding out the species where this the virus originated from, how it jumped the species barrier, when it might have jumped, whether there was one event or multiple events, what can be done to prevent. The whole idea of finding that out is to prevent future episodes, because we know this is how pandemics come. We've known for a long time that pandemics, when a pandemic came, it would come most likely a respiratory virus, most likely from the animal kingdom, it would be a zoonotic infection, and it would jump the animal-human barrier. So we really need to work with our veterinary colleagues and so on to understand how these things happen and how they can be prevented in the future. So that's really the goal of the investigation.
Just one final question. We're now in the month of July. Cases continue to mount across the world. India, 20,000 a day. Across the world, more than 200,000. Do you believe in this country the worst is yet to come? That the virus, which has now principally been in the big cities, could now spread to smaller towns? Will we have to live with the virus for several months, certainly till the end of 2020?
I think we'll have to live with the virus, Rajdeep. It will be very difficult to eliminate the virus till we have a vaccine, and even that's going to take a bit of time to have enough immunity. But so what we need to focus on is how do you keep it under control at a level that's manageable, that's not impacting people's lives, not impacting the economy, and not impacting the delivery of other health services. And so I think over the last few months, the states have prepared themselves. We've learned a lot collectively.
Right.
I think countries have learned from each other, states have learned from each other. So I would say that going forward, what's important is that local data, local decision-making, local leadership, local accountability, and the involvement of the community in developing and delivering the response is going to be critical. So at the national level, of course, the policy and the strategy and perhaps certain benchmarks could be set. But the more decentralized the approach, I think the more successful it will be in the long run. And testing, as we said earlier, is going to play an important role, but in conjunction with the other public health measures, which we know. And many places in India have shown that they can very successfully contain even outbreaks which looked as though they're going out of control.
Right.
So I think important message is not to give up, not to think that it's too late, that it can't be contained and it can be done. And I think predicting peaks and it doesn't really help. I think the effort should be to try to contain and to try to mitigate and manage the outbreak as I think has been done so far. But things will happen in different times in different states. And I think for one state which has done well and recovered, to be able to provide support to another state when they may need a surge support,
right,
would also be, I think, very good to plan for the future.
Soumya Swaminathan, you've used the word manage the crisis as a critical challenge that lies ahead. Thank you so much for joining me here on the news today. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajdeep.
That's the Chief Scientist of the World Health Organization. Up next, I'll be back with my image of the day. Back in a moment. You're watching the news today. News without the noise. Back in a moment.
Hello everyone, this is Rahul Kamal here. Hope you enjoyed this video. For the latest news and analysis, like and subscribe the India Today YouTube channel, and don't forget to press the bell icon to stay updated.